to define our terms. For me, I think over a few years of doing this, learned some things about how to define our terms and what works and what doesn't. And frankly, we see plenty that hasn't worked. So just a few things. I would say that defining our terms, defining our housing crisis simply by numbers is something we've tried. And boy, the numbers are bad. And we can throw around the 2 billion on TA or the 270,000 households for homeless in different forms or average age of death. All of these things are bad, getting worse, but frankly, they haven't shifted political will. There's a time and a place for these things, but they haven't shifted political will. And crisis is helping 10,000 people a year, and none of those people are helped by us just shouting louder about how bad things are. So perhaps a better way of defining our terms is in human terms. And I think if you're trying to persuade people in power, which is what we're all here for, I guess, at the Christ Conference, about things that they should care about, perhaps the things that stick in your own mind should be the things that you have a go at trying to get into other people's minds. And there are two things that recently have really stuck in my mind. One was a few months ago, a mother of a teenage daughter got in touch with me to say that she was helping her daughter revise for her GCSEs in a tent. Their family, both parents work, two teenage children, been told by the council that they refused a reasonable offer and there was nothing further for them, and they were living in a tent. And it just sort of made me think, I've got a daughter, there are lots of things about that scenario that there should be warning signs for the way in which we think differently. Everything about it is wrong, and the council responds to the situation the council's in to even make that response. And something else that stuck in my mind recently was a case of a woman in her 50s who was sleeping rough in East London and had been sleeping rough on and off for many, many years, having experienced the worst stories and experiences of abuse, not just domestic abuse, but all forms of other abuse as well. And when it came to her homelessness application, she was told she was too complex to be housed. So she wasn't under the threshold, she was over the threshold. The happy ending to that story is she is now housed, and this support of our Housing First team is moving on with her life. But we've reached Kafkaesque levels of human stories here, and I think many people amongst you will know other stories like that, and perhaps that's the way to start defining what our housing crisis is. I think another way to think about it, and perhaps this is what we really should be doing, is to start defining it by the scale of solutions we need and the areas of those solutions that we need to focus on. So, sadly, right here, right now, we're due a long-term plan. We're due a long-term homelessness plan. It's more than a year, and we've been waiting for those things. Some ministers have come and gone. Some spending reviews, budgets, and different opportunities have come and gone. And we're waiting to see whether it's worth the wait, frankly. And we're absolutely willing to give the government the benefit of the doubt to say, take the time to get it right, but you really have to come at this with some ambition now. And in three particular areas, they've really got to come at it with ambition. Firstly, on supply. Obviously, the 39 billion, which I've told today went up to 40 billion from Rachel Reeves, maybe just in the way she expressed it, we'll take it as a win now. That's good. Of course that's good. And you get nowhere on housing homelessness until you've got a bedrock of getting out of the situation we're in. But let's be really clear. We've lost 180,000 units of social housing over the last decade. And at the rates at which they've said they'll spend that money on social housing, that would get you back 180,000 units. So we'd be back to where we started. Meanwhile, we've got an epidemic of homelessness. And even if that money is spent in the right way, it's a 10-year plan, and who knows what the levels of homelessness will be. So it's a good start, but really we need 90,000 units of social housing every year. Otherwise, the enormous amount of pressure on the private rental sector continues, and all the things we know about there. So I feel like the test of the definition of housing crisis or what we do about homelessness is whether the government throws absolutely everything at its long-term housing plan, not just saying, here's some money for the future. I mean everything, empty homes, conversions, acquisitions, everything. And then there's affordability. I think it's worth saying that over the last few years, without many people in the non-policy world noticing, the link between what the benefit system is there for and what it gives you in terms of the kind of philosophy of that or the practical reality of that was broken. It was frozen, it was frozen, and we're now in a situation where in many, many parts of the country, including this part of the country, there are certain parts of Liverpool, many other cities where there's virtually nothing left in terms of what's accessible to people on housing benefit because it's been frozen. So what that means is homelessness. What that then means is local councils in trouble. What that then means is bankruptcy. It means temporary accommodation and spending money on the wrong things. So unless you've got a plan for re-establishing the link between what housing benefits are meant to achieve and the rates that it's paid, and you've got a plan to transition away from a mass use of temporary accommodation, the plan's not good enough. And finally, there's accessibility, because even when there were better times, it's worth saying that we are used to excluding people because they don't fit the right definition of what homelessness is. So that's a problem that we've had for a long time, and it's getting worse in new and different ways. So, of course, to have any conception of non-priority homelessness guarantees homelessness. That needs dealing with, like it's been dealt with in Scotland. But also, we have this situation where now, if your needs are too low or they're too high, you can be excluded. If your own income seems to be not enough for social housing, it's now possible and regularly happens in this country that you seem to be too poor for social housing. That happens. Everyone knows that, but that happens. And then there's allocations. So many people who should be accessing social housing don't get in because not everyone's the same in terms of the whole social housing sector, but there are plenty of providers that simply aren't allocating their homes to the people that their organisation was set up to support. So any strategy going forward has to do all of those things. And there's more to, of course, the way in which we're systematically, routinely excluding people from migration status and other things like that needs to be sorted out. But it's time for the moment to be met with ambition. I think nothing else will do, simply because you won't solve the problem. If you tinker around the edges of the housing and homelessness system, it will just be a game of whack-a-mole. Walking around and saying we're spending money on this whilst ignoring that doesn't work. We've had 14 years of that. So it's time for a completely different shift in ambition. And I actually don't care if we have a really good homelessness plan, as long as ending homelessness is the objective of the housing plan. I think that's fine, but we do need the absolute most ambitious way forward, otherwise we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. That's hard to follow and also hard to hear. And I think I'll answer this question about supply in a moment. But what you said about how many housing events there are now really struck me. Because I remember when I started reporting on the housing crisis now about 15 years ago. And I remember when I started writing a book that in the end took me 7 years to write, my fear was, oh, but what if they fixed it by the time it comes out? And I'm not just saying that to make you laugh, like I genuinely thought that. And then Theresa May became Prime Minister, and for a moment it looked as though some things might happen that would genuinely make it better. It's now years down the line and we still don't have Section 21 gone. That is happening, and it will happen, but the fact that it's still not happened up until this government speaks to how naive I was. But the main thing that I was naive about was that it could ever get this bad. I don't think for a moment when I started doing my job, I thought things could get worse. I really thought we're at the bottom of how bad it could be. And before I come to supply and politics, we are at a political conference and supply really is the only thing that's being talked about. Although I was pleased that ending homelessness was in Steve Green's speech, at least it did get a shout out. Some things that have stuck in my mind recently. I spent a day at a crisis skylight centre in Oxford, and it was a brilliant day, but I did leave feeling incredibly sad. You know, it was heartbreaking. One of the things that keeps coming up is, well, we're seeing people on middle incomes now. Crisis are helping people on middle incomes. They were telling me they'd seen a doctor and an academic who were evicted and couldn't afford rent anywhere else in the city, but they weren't qualified for social housing. So where are they supposed to go? I don't think anyone has an answer to that, and that frankly terrifies me. I am a middle class, middle income person. I've got friends who are in a situation like that. We're not helping people at the sharp end. That's getting worse. We've got more children in temporary accommodation. But now this is spreading up the income scale, and I don't think anybody has an answer. We seem to go round and round on rent control. Nobody wants to really tackle the cost of renting. And then that brings me to supply. Build Baby Build is the mantra of this conference. It's alliterative, I'll give it that. But frankly, I looked at economists recently for a longer term project I'm working on about the housing crisis, including people who worked at the Bank of England. I've been asking them all the same question. So is supply the answer in and of itself? If we just, even if build these 1.5 million homes within the allotted time period, would that fix the housing crisis? Let's just be clear, by the way, that isn't going to no, it wouldn't. It's a completely fictional scenario. Things are now so bad that you're talking about a short-term emergency. I don't think it's even a crisis anymore. Medium term, even if we could build homes at that kind of scale and pace, it might help some people, maybe the wealthier private renters, but it's not going to make housing more affordable overnight. Longer term, 15, 20 years, it might stabilise prices, but and these aren't just my opinions, these are the opinions of economists I've been talking to. It's not going to cause a housing market crash, and I don't think that's what Labour want to be the party of either. So I am concerned about the turn towards supply, the mantra, how much prominence is being given, because every expert I talk to that I trust says the same thing. This isn't about numbers, it's about tenure. It's about the fact that middle income people, middle class people can't afford to buy houses. And the only thing I'm hearing from the government on that is, okay, well, we'll just increase the amount they can borrow in relation to their income. Note that Rachel Reeves was only able to get one bank to expand the scheme, and that's nationwide, that they already had. I'm speaking to the banks too. They do not want to be lending in that way. They feel quite risk averse. We're living in incredibly uncertain times, and when you're looking at somebody paying, my flat cost me $500,000. I bought it with Help to Buy. I regularly wake up in the night thinking about my mortgage because I will be paying it until I'm retired. Like Rachel Reeves was saying today, the world has changed. When it comes to housing, it really has changed. Like even the lucky people like me will be repaying our mortgages long after, even if we retire. But what about all of the children that I have met who are growing up in temporary accommodation? They were living in temporary accommodation before Labour won the election, and at this rate I fear they'll still be living in temporary accommodation after the next election. And that also regularly wakes me up at night. It's so terrifying. And I'll just end by saying I particularly think the family who are living in a converted office block in Hull, and I met them for the first time before the pandemic. And they're still there. The kids are getting bigger, the room's not getting bigger, and the council's actually not Harlech, they were moved to Harlech. The council doesn't have anything for them, so they need a three-bedroom family home. It's so serious now that I'm running out of ways to say how serious it is.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. Welcome Emily Darlington and Paul for the HSBG on homelessness. I hope you don't mind if I just throw the mic straight over to you to say a couple of words about the sort of work you're doing. Thoughts on this?
Really happy to.
prior to becoming an MP, I was the deputy leader of Milton Keynes City Council and had both housing and adult social care in my portfolio. And the reason I say both, and I asked for both, is because so many of our housing issues cross over with our adult social care. We have to stop seeing people as just a house. We have to see people in the communities and the services that they need. I always talk about Milton Keynes. We have overbuilt, over-delivered on every single one of our housing targets as we went while having a Labour Council. We're very proud of that, yet we still have 1,000 families in temporary accommodation, and that means over 1,000 children in temporary accommodation. Not counting those people in temporary accommodation in Milton Keynes have been put there by various London local authorities, which just makes it worse. We have an affordability crisis. You are absolutely right. And it doesn't just get solved by building more homes. We have to have a debate about the kind of homes we're building and the kind of communities we're building, because in my view, we build homes and communities, we don't just build houses. And that means you need places to play and places to pray. You need schools and you need GP surgeries, you need community centres. All of that comes together. But the reality is they're not affordable. They're not affordable to people that already live on Keynes. So what we're also dealing with is a hidden overcrowding problem. And then we have some really weird incentives in the system that we need to sort. Some government can sort. Looking at why our pension system is, our mortgage system is the way it is. One, given the exact same providers, HSBC, what they provide in terms of their mortgage products in Canada or in France are much better than the mortgage products they provide here. Much better. Now, I like to kind of believe that if you get a 30-year mortgage, it's a 30-year mortgage. You don't renegotiate it every 2 years and pay all the on costs and the additional costs that you have to do. I also think our rental system has a completely perverse incentive because of the use of rental agents every 6 months. They only get paid when they move people in and out, so they move people in and out every 6 months. The reality is, trying to negotiate, and this is what we did as council, long-term, stable rental agreements, 2-3 years. Right? Because rental should be an option. Rental's not a stopgap. Rental may be a choice for people at different points in their lives, whether it's because they're young and they want that ability to move around the country for work, or whether that's because they're older and want to release the equity from the house that they owned earlier so that they can travel, or they can give it to their kids, or whatever they want to do with it, but actually they prefer to rent in some kind of community housing where it's other older people. We need these options, but we seem to think rental is second-class housing. You only rent because you can't afford to buy. No, it's an active choice for people, and it needs to be affordable. We seem to think that we should put regulation on councils to have good social homes, but private landlords don't get held to the same standard. When a council wants to build council homes, they're held to these standards in terms of housing. A private developer can build it cheaper and less well and sell it for 5 times as much. We have perverse incentives. We've done a lot under the planning, and that's really important. But we haven't done enough to actually look at why our housing sector is completely upside down from where it should be. And some people take this back to Margaret Thatcher and her everybody should own a house and all that kind of stuff. Some of it's kind of become cultural. But the reality is our houses, even the ones that are newly being built, are too expensive for most people to buy. And that means you're going to keep excluding people from the housing ladder. And if you didn't get on the housing ladder, you know, I was lucky, I'm Gen X, I got on the housing ladder in 2004, I think. I hadn't done it then. There's no way I'd be on the housing ladder today. So I'm going to leave it there because I know there'll be lots of questions, but these are kind of some of my challenges, and hopefully we'll get on to talk about some of the solutions.
Thank you so much. So I'm now going to throw it you three, if you could ask for one thing that you want to see from the new Secretary of State for Housing, what would you want to see? And I know that it is a holistic challenge, but I'm curious about whether you think, and I think one of the challenges here isn't those long-term or those short-term solutions, but are there things that you feel like you would want to see that would be at least a step in the right direction, or that there's a sort of understanding of a sort of full scale of the crisis that we're in?
Yeah, there is, and it costs nothing to start. What I'd really like to see is that the point of housing policy isn't the number. I would like the Secretary of State for Housing and the Prime Minister to say the point of the 1.5 million housing target is to end homelessness, to increase educational outcomes, to sort out adult social care, and the variation of other things that can be done through that. Know as a country what we're trying to achieve, rather than just running around after an output number. So imagine you're at local authority level, you're a housing provider, you're a developer, you're a charity, whoever it is. What you're aiming towards is a human outcome, not just a kind of number on a spreadsheet. I think that would really make a difference.
92?
I'll allow it.
Okay. One, stop treating councils like they're all anti-development. And that, in that, give them the powers to say what they actually need and want. And not just number of houses, but the kinds of houses, the affordability of the houses, and let them have the arguments with developers on the margins. And don't have a planning inspector that then can come along and say, actually, you don't need to do the affordable. Right, it's not. Sorry, no, that was the deal. So that's number one. Second one is, I would stop this absolute concrete wall around housing revenue counts. Milton Keynes Council spends 20 million a year on temporary accommodation. It cannot do a business case that says, rather than spend £20 million a year on temporary accommodation, we're going to spend half of that building new council homes, because there's a concrete wall, or whatever you want to call it, put around the housing revenue count. It makes no sense.
Thank you.
I cheated by going last because I wanted to hear what you were going to say. I think there are so many things I'd like to make happen, but there is one that I would like to see happen immediately, and that is just give everybody who's homeless in a temporary accommodation home. Make sure those kids are growing up in the homes that they need, because unless you really reincarnation, you're up one night on this earth and people's lives are being ruined.
Compelling set of four. Thanks. I'm going to open it up to the floor. I'll take things in groups of three, and I'm going to be strict about asking for questions rather than comments. I'll go here, here, and here, and I'll come to you next.
It's Seth Clear from Shelter. It's been striking at this conference. As another person we speak to from local authorities complain about viability and about the fact that every time they're trying to build more social rent homes, developers are just pushing back again and again and again. And they really want to be building social rent as part of solving as a crisis, but they have to compromise again and again and again. How can we actually finally fix this and make sure that developers are actually delivering more social rent homes?
Thanks, Stephen from Inside Housing. I also mentioned shared ownership, given we've spoken a lot about supply and affordability. There's been a lot of issues around that with shared ownership, and I wonder whether that still deserves to be part of the solution, and whether the grant money would be better spent on social rent, for example.
Thanks. Dan Wilson-Craw from Generation Rent. One thing Emily said was that house prices are too high for people to buy, which I think is a big part of the problem with political problem that people can't access home ownership anymore. Given that a lot of voters are homeowners and they're potentially benefiting from high house prices, to what extent can we tame house prices, and what might that do to solve the crisis?
Thank you. So just 3 small topics for you all there. Does anyone want to come in on any one of them? We've got the sort of question about sort of housing and building, a shared ownership question, and then house prices.
Yeah, okay, so on developers pushing back, that's such a big problem. But I will give credit to the head of housing at Wandsworth Council, who when he took on that job, invited all, it's called IDIM, he invited all of the developers in for sandwiches of water in the town hall, and he banned all his local councils from having meetings that were off the books. And he said, if you want to build in Wandsworth, you will meet the affordability criteria. And for a while it seemed to work. So that's one item. Shared ownership, I think, is an incredibly problematic product. So what if we just stopped doing it and fixed all the other stuff, and then we could return to shared ownership of the internet? I hear from so many people who are being hammered with rents and who have all sorts of problems trying to sell shared ownership homes. And that doesn't get talked about enough. And Dan, I don't think there's much we can do about house prices without tanking the economy. And we probably have to accept that they are going to stay where they are, best case scenario. It would be very, very bad if they fell. It would also be very, very bad if they rose much more. So that speaks to how serious it is that we actually need the market to stay in this strange sort of state of stall that it's in, because I think actually a move in either direction would be really serious.
Yeah, it's a politically problematic problem. I don't know who you use. The reality is, in Britain, quite uniquely, we put our savings and our investment into our houses rather than stocks and shares and other ways that you sort of see it happen, which means that we are particularly politically sensitive to house prices. And therefore, if there was to be a big crash in house prices, you better believe that the Labour government wouldn't be seen again for 30 years. I mean, that's how problematic it is. So, of course, we don't want that to happen, but what we do need then is to say, how do you then make things more affordable? Now, part of that's bringing down the cost of actually building. We know leaving Europe was creating a huge problem in house building. Not just the workers, but the materials and others. That's the reality. And I think we need to be a little bit more open with people. For houses, you're going to need to figure out how you deal with the fact that the actual materials cost more and the actual labor costs more. That's what developers will tell you. They're still making a good hefty margin. The other problem we have is there are no SME builders, or very, very few. So in fact, we have a bit of a monopoly of these big house builders that quite frankly can dictate their terms and conditions, or think they can, unless you give councils the power. Whether Wandsworth wants to do it that way. These off-book meetings, I have to say, I've never once been offered a brown envelope, and you would have thought in Milton Keynes that would be a big thing. Very little of that, as I understand it, happens, though I'm sure it does happen somewhere. It certainly doesn't happen in Milton Keynes. I wanted to pick up on shared ownership. One of the biggest scams about shared ownership is the service charge. And that's not just a scam for shared ownership, it's also a scam for new build housing, where quite frankly, and we call it leasehold, whatever you want to call it, but the reality is this service charge, where they don't hand over things to the council, whether it be the green space, the roads or whatever, and continue to charge, and quite frankly, decide what they want to charge as long as it's market. We can do things like right to manage and others, but the reality is we just need to stop it. You're buying a house, you're not buying a share of the road. That road should just be handed over at a proper quality. And then finally, your point was on
Viability.
the viability. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm really happy to turn it. We're next door to Bucks County Council, or whatever they're called now, and they only allow building on our borders. But more importantly, they never meet their housing targets. So yeah, if you need a government regulator, inspector to overturn their decisions, fine, because there are always no's. But when you have good Labour councils that are pro-development, but pro-good development. That doesn't mean saying yes to everything. Give them the power to be able to say no, and don't let developers think that they can go to an inspector to just overturn that decision.
Just a couple of things. I mean, I think on the viability thing, you can tell the government was trying to do something about these issues. The National Housing Plan is meant to be about speeding up decisions. There's plenty of stuff that's being attempted in planning on the planning side. I think they're going to find out it's not enough. So sort of getting ahead of that and saying this isn't going to be enough. How it should work is the question. Shared ownership I find fascinating because one of the biggest providers of shared ownership surveyed the people who are purchasing through them, and they discovered the number one reason that the people wanted shared ownership wasn't to get on the housing ladder, it was security and tenure because the PRS wasn't in it. So it's a solution that needs to run after the right problem, which can be achieved through how we regulate the PRS. It's sort of completely skewing what it was there for. So, and I sort of think, so the theme of kind of does the moment meet the crisis, and do the strategies meet the crisis? I can't help thinking about how the government have thought about leadership on climate. So it's big enough, it's awful enough to say we're going to have to do something much bigger to recast the way we think, as we said to start with, challenge the assumptions, great British energy, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's what we need here. A sort of all singing, all dancing. Everything is now monitored. The level of political capital that housing has needs to go up and up and up. And I think all of these individual issues need capturing.
I'll take another round of questions. You had your hand up before, and then I'll go right there, and then I'll go here.
We've lost the loans in Merton to HMOs because estate agents are promoting them and saying this is where you make money, we've lost loads. So we've had to introduce HMOs go to planning if they're in specific wards now. We've also introduced selective landlord licensing, which is something the government should have done, and that is really helping. But also we've taken out final management order on a rogue landlord, and we are the first in the country to do that. And I think we need to be doing more of these things to protect people who are in the houses already so they're not evicted. Because once landlords know that your area is not one they're going to put up with any nonsense, they'll stop coming.
Sorry, stop.
Yes.
Do you agree? That's what we do in Parliament. Do you agree?
That's the amendment.
Hi there, my name is Bridget Young from NACCOM, the No Accommodation Network. I wanted to ask around, there's a lot of work happening around how we change asylum accommodation, sort of actually, spearheaded by IPPR's excellent report around essentially, repurposing how asylum accommodation is funded and delivered to create assets in the community that can benefit the wider community. And I just wanted to ask the panel from a sort of supply and delivery point of view, what impact you thought that would have, but also how practical and realistic the mechanisms for being able to do it are.
Hi, Jack from YMCA. So we're looking at building lots of new homes in the next kind of 5-10 years. And one thing we're talking a lot about building, but actually creating homes is also part of it. Just intrigued about panel's opinion on refurbing existing buildings, that hotels, spots to kind of build new homes for people as well, because that's something we're also exploring. Is it part of the solution?
Thank you so much. So we're going to do a quick round of these questions, and I'm going to turn to so we have sort of HMOs, asylum accommodation, and then the refurb point. Does anyone want to take them?
I'm happy to take them. They're big issues though. The refurb point, my big worry about refurb is you're taking non-purpose building and you're trying to retrofit it. And let me tell you about the plumbing problems that happen as a result. Let me tell you about the security problems. Let me tell you about the size and the sound problems that you get. I, quite frankly, and we've done this in Milton Keynes, we banned it. I'm sorry, you're not going to do an off-book just retrofit. It's not appropriate accommodation, nor does it work. And quite frankly, the way they were trying to do it then was just warehousing. That's not all right. That is not all right. HMOs, I'm going to be a bit controversial here. There is a role for HMOs in our housing supply. If you're single, and you can't, and you're starting off and you can't afford a huge amount of rent, an HMO is a viable opportunity. Where I have a real problem with HMOs is, first of all, you're a business. Therefore, you should pay business rates, not council rates, because you have 8 bins, not 1. So let's treat you like a business, because you're making money as a business. So let's treat you as that, first of all. Second of all, you've got to ensure safety and security. My big issue is women, lone women that live in HMOs, and nobody's considered the other people that they're living with. Especially if you're a vulnerable woman, that can lead to huge, huge problems. And then the final one is asylum. There's a really important thing that we're doing on asylum applications. First of all, we need to get to a point where we don't have all of these people waiting on lists to find out the outcome of their asylum application. And that's some really good work being done by government on that. But that is not where we're at. So where we are at now, and I can tell you in Milton Keynes, at the height, we had 4 hotels. And we went in there as a council, because first of all, we didn't know who the hell was there, because the Home Office didn't bother to tell us. So that was job number 1. But people are coming over, often, and this was a mix of people who were coming from Afghanistan, but also people that had come over on boats. The level of need and trauma that these people have, especially the children, is so important. Who are you mixing in together in that hotel? What kind of services are you doing? And the fact is, you've got some councils, progressive Labour councils, that go in and provide services, not because the Home Office has asked them to, because they don't bother telling us who's in there at any given point, but because it's the right thing to do, because we're human. And then you've got other councils that do nothing and create more community division and just whine, and just like complain that they're taking their share. If we're moving to places like ex-military sites, what we need to be thinking about again is not just the houses, but what are the services that we're doing and putting on that site to make sure that when they get their decision, they're either prepared to be put on a plane home because they didn't make it, or they're prepared to join British society and work and build a life that they couldn't in their home country. And that's my worry about the current plan. I think it is a good plan. I think you can do it in that plan, but have we thought about it? And then finally, just stop taking the money from the ODA budget, from the Overseas Development Budget. It's the wrong place to take it completely. It needs to be seen in the context of the immigration budget, not the Overseas Development Budget.
Ranging around, double. I suppose I just wanted to, particularly on the refurbishing question, say, I personally, if YMCA wants to get into individual real homes for people and let that be the direction of travel away from the congregate agency accommodation, that's wonderful.
They are doing that.
So we definitely don't want Terminus House in Harlow, that sort of stuff, which won't be what you're doing. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the homelessness strategy helps people like YMCA and Crisis that want to directly provide homes to people, real everyday homes, because we can't get any. There's no social housing left in the urban sectors working. So the homelessness sector is having to reinvent itself back to the sort of formation of the housing association sector many, many years ago. So we need help to do it, and I think as long as we do it well, it's a good thing.
Yeah, I would say, I think it speaks volumes that we now have charities providing housing again. And it's great that you guys are doing it, but I find that really troubling. On landlord regulation in HMOs, I suppose what I could add that's helpful there is that yes, obviously, landlords should be regulated and they should play by the rules, but we do have a growing problem tenants were several couples who are living in an HMO, and I think we're going to be seeing much more of that. You know, lots of people tell me it's really utopian, isn't it amazing for couples to be living in communes, and I don't think that's really how it works. So I hope someone's got a solution to that. And then I suppose on the side of accommodation, I would just say we are in a situation where the Home Office is competing with local councils often over hotel space. So local councils need temporary accommodation because they don't have enough social housing. So something has to give somewhere. And I'm not sure that it's being handled brilliantly, but it is getting increasingly urgent. We could start by building social housing.
Sounds like there is a theme emerging. One of the other solutions that wasn't on our list earlier is to build a lot more social housing to get along with it. And really delighted to be joined by Rachel Labour MP, who's Vice Chair of the Labour Housing Group. I'm going to hand over to you to say a few words, and then I'll probably open up to another round, probably the last round of questions.
Thanks. I'll be very quick. I'm no longer Vice Chair of the Labour Housing Group. I'm a patron of the Labour Housing Group. But just the current Vice Chair, I should say that for their benefit. I think that this room knows that there are some really positive stories about investing 39 million in genuinely affordable homes in this country. So I wanted to focus on two particular areas that I think there is space to do a lot more work collaboratively. The first is about temporary accommodation, and the second is about supported housing. And I come at this from a pretty much a London perspective, and also being the member of Parliament for the cities of London and Westminster, which has the important housing history stories that maybe we'll talk about it later, because it's a microcosm of everything that is wrong, but everything that also could be right about housing in London. So London local authorities are spending £4 million a day on temporary accommodation. Temporary accommodation is not a good place to grow up. It doesn't give you the certainty that you need as a family to be able to put down roots, and it is incredibly costly, and it's often really poor quality. I think there is an awful lot more space for local and regional authorities to work together to make sure that they're not competing for particular homes, and also to make sure that we're checking the quality of these homes. And actually, I'm pretty sure that you will have some Londoners in Milton Keynes into accommodation. So there's a need for that kind of collaboration within local and between regions as well, to make sure that there is information sharing about the quality. And I do think, whilst that isn't releasing a huge amount of supply, that could actually improve overall costs, which would have a benefit in terms of investment in supply. And then I wanted to talk about supported housing, because we used to talk a lot about it 20 years ago. There used to be a great supply of it 20 years ago, and now I have the highest levels of cross linking in my constituency, and we know, I think we have really quite good outreach services that Westminster City Council commissions. We have quite good support in that space, but where I do hear both from people who are living in hostels or who have lived experience of sleeping off, is the moving on accommodation from hostels into supported housing, that I think as a sector, as a community, as representatives, it's worth us really thinking about the role of supported housing going forward, because it plays such an important role in helping people to thrive and move on with their lives. And I'm keen to hear more from you guys.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any quick
Let's go.
Okay, let's do another round. I love that you guys put the camera almost in threes. I think there was one at the back. I actually can't see your face, but I can see your hand, and you with the pen. You had your hand up last time. I'll go there, and then I'll go over here, and then I'll go over there, and then I'll come to you two next at this time.
Hello, Will Hurst from the Architects Journal. I wanted to come back on the refurbishment point, or in fact, adaptive reuse of existing buildings, because I was very surprised at what you had to say on that, Emily. I mean, obviously, if it's a question of quality, there's many, many examples of terribly poor new build housing. So I'm not sure why, poor quality refurbishment would put you off the whole idea. Historic England did a report quite recently where they said the government could deliver 670,000 homes just from using buildings of over 100 years old. So if you factor in younger buildings, all the 20th century buildings, we're talking about, probably the majority of the 1.5 million target. So would the panel agree with me that given the greenest building is the one that already exists, they're all plugged into existing infrastructure, they help SMEs, you know, because it would be architects and SME builders doing this work, not volume house builders, that this is an opportunity waiting for the government to grasp it?
Hi, I'm Kat Totty, I'm a policy manager for HomelessLink. Thank you, it's been really insightful, and we've heard very clearly about the need for more social housing. Absolutely agree, obviously, but that takes time and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So I just wondered if you could talk a little more about what we can be doing tomorrow to be supporting people who need it right now while we wait for social housing to come on.
I'm Lauren Nielsen, and this might be a bit big to finish, but I spent my life campaigning about children in temporary accommodation, and then my young sons are now living in HMO shared properties, not being able to move on. And then my 8-year-old dad is stuck in a 5-bedroom house in Hertfordshire that he desperately needs to move out and move into rented accommodation for older people. So I'm middle class, and yet the housing crisis is hitting every generation of my family. My question is, how do we talk about this that isn't either oppositional against different groups, or opposition about intergenerational, or opposition against kind of owners and renters? And I guess, how do we have that conversation in the public realm that is the whole of my family, and I am just one of millions? So it is cutting across, so how do we talk about it well?
Thank you so much for those questions. Yeah, so we had this sort of adaptive reuse and refurb question, how do we make use of existing stock and what kind of stock. We had the immediate interventions, and then you have the sort of framing piece that doesn't end up mixing.
I'm going to dive in because I think Emily doesn't mean the kind of retrofit that Will has specialised in, knowing both of you as I do. But I'm not here to mediate, but I just offering up that insight. I'm sure Emily will want to the retrofit a bit more. I think immediately we can be doing much more on buybacks. I think that's something that London local authorities are making a real benefit from, and I think they can also be quite good value for money. And then just I think the point that you make about how do we talk about this problem, the story that you just described is a really important way of talking about the problem, really naming some of those big that big transactional friction that you've described there in terms of your dad living in a home that doesn't quite suit him, they're not quite being the right places for him to be able to live. So many of us are now living intergenerational families and can tell very similar stories to that. We're all living differently to how we did 20, 40 years ago, and I think consistently telling those stories and recognising where that transactional friction is in terms of availability of resources is really, really important. I don't think it needs to be opposition. I think there is a really positive story that we can continue to tell about new build and communities, which goes alongside how we use our existing stock more effectively. I think within some very occasionally within the lovely housing family, we fall into quite some either-ors, and either you're a supply person, you're a homelessness person, and I think really there is no one solution to this. We need action on all sorts of different levels. We need to be making local authorities, commission, temporary accommodation more effectively together. We need to be providing housing first solutions alongside person-centred solutions at the same time. We need to look at the way that property is owned and distributed alongside building new homes. But stories like yours are a really important part of continuing to make this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I think on the refurb question, the problem is been committed to London, so it needs to be rewritten. It's failed us. It's how you end up with appalling stuff that you have to say no to really a new regime. Yeah, we need a completely new regime on that as well. That's how I put it. So just in terms of the kind of immediate solutions, I've got 4 things. 3 of them cost money and 1 of them's free.
What's the free one? Tell us the free one.
The free one is housing association allocations. So it's somewhere like half the rate of applications for social housing providers in England go to this another way. If you're in Scotland, you're twice as likely to get allocated social housing if you're local to England. So it is something that maybe we can say, because we don't want all social housing to be for homeless households, but we're in some form of crisis emergency, however we want to put it. Now is the time to sweat the asset. And I would say, under that auspice of kind of, now is the time to deal with this, looking through the lens of just how acute the crisis is. We've got to do that. And housing associations won't like it. Some of them won't, but I think that's important. The ones that cost money, local housing allowance, uprate it now. It's absolutely desperate, and while we're at it, uprate the subsidy that local authorities get. It's absolutely madness. They get 90% of the 2011 local housing allowance rate, and it's breaking the banks of local authority finances alongside everything else. And finally, roll out housing first everywhere. We know it works. Let's do it all in high school.
So I'll take the retrofit point. It is about permitted development. You're absolutely right, and I should have been clear about that. The reality is, what's done through permitted development, there's quite a lot of problems with. They're retrofitting empty office buildings. Great, I'm all for that. But what they're not doing is upgrading the plumbing, which is a serious issue. Because office buildings do not have the greatest plumbing, that people that are having showers and living there and everything. And they're also not upgrading necessarily the fire safety issues. I sit on the board of our local fire authority. The reality is those buildings cause problems. They also cause problems because they don't have any Section 106 attached to them. And if you're going to move 300 people into a new area and not have money to put into the GP surgery and into the school and into other facilities that those people are going to use, that causes a huge friction. And it's a significant problem. On homelessness, I mean, so on rough sleeping, my view is we should get rid of SWEP, because every local authority, and this is what we're in Milton Keynes, says no second night out. No second night out. That's the policy 365 days of the year in Milton Keynes. There is no second night out. And then we have to stop thinking about it as a housing issue, you think about it as an adult social care issue, and how you bring everything around the individual. Some people are going to need a lot of help, and some people are not going to need much help. But the big game changer and the cost saving, which was just a hypothesis to begin with, but is now absolutely proven through the MK data, is if you get somebody on the first night that they're sleeping out, their road back into supported accommodation or just a temporary accommodation or actual accommodation, the long-term accommodation, is so much shorter. As soon as you spend a week on the street, it takes you longer. You spend 2 weeks, you spend 3 weeks, a month. All of that exponentially extends your time of being in insecure housing. You can get them on night one, and that should be the policy right across the country.
On adaptive reuse, I suppose you have a slight advantage of me because I'm not on the panel, so you can Google this. But I'd be interested to know where all of those buildings you mentioned are, because I love the sound of reusing existing buildings. I agree, it makes sense. They're often very good buildings and it would be greener. But a lot of the empty buildings that could be repurposed, as I understand it, are not actually where we need the homes.
It's more the tax discrepancy. We pay 20% on any form of refurbishment and 0% new build house.
Yeah, and obviously I agree with that. But I think location is really important, because people say this to me all the time. I was interviewing some people last week who are NIMBYs but don't think that they are, because they're opposing a development in their area, which is a suburb of London, and they were saying, why don't we just use all of the empty homes? I was like, because they're not where the jobs are. So there's that, and that actually leads into the question about generations that Laura had. Both of these women actually had their children still living with them, their adult children. So okay, so what you're saying is you don't want your children to live in your borough. Just go to a home wherever it is. And I think this conversation is so fractious. Even in my own family, I had a horrible conversation with my mum recently. She was like, "You just want my house." I don't want your house. Just making the point, you probably don't need it. That's just you. But it's very, very, very hard to have that conversation, because I think And I completely understand why people are so emotional about their homes. I understand why my mum feels that way about her house. It's her house. I actually really don't want to live there. It's not in a place that I would want to be. But for a young family, it would be amazing. And that's the problem. Like, I'm failing to communicate that to the people who are closest to me. So how we have it as a national conversation, I'm not the person to advise on. And based on the people that write into me whenever I write about downsizing, you don't want me anywhere near it. And I just echo what Matt said actually about upraising NHA and TA subsidy. I know a piece come out last week. I worked with the LGA on about the £260 million gap between what you can get back from TA and what's available. And that's a huge one. And authorities really need the money. And they can spend a billion people who are sleeping on the streets of the streets. So it makes no sense. But none of this makes any sense to me anymore.
I'm conscious of time. I think there are two with their hands up. So if you promise to keep your questions incredibly punchy, I'll allow it. I think it was due to
Hi, I'm Louise from Independent Trade for the National Charity for Old People Facing Financial Hardship. It's just picking up on the LHA point. I feel that there's political will for almost everything apart from that aspect. So how do we achieve that?
That's punchy. Good job.
I was going to go ahead and say so I'll wrap up in. I won't even ask.
And I'm going to ask the panelists to sort of answer that question, and then also sort of wrap up any sort of final reflections from the discussion. I'll go to you, Jeff.
Okay. So LHA, absolutely. It makes no sense whatsoever. It needs to be reviewed, and it needs to be reviewed in the light of not just what the costs are, but actually how much we're cross-subsidising. So yes, absolutely, it needs a review and it needs to be done properly. And we need to acknowledge the fact that places outside of London also have additional costs, not just in London. My overwhelming, just kind of final thing, I know I've said a lot of really negative things, but the reality is I am quite optimistic. I'm quite optimistic because we're finally having housing discussions and homelessness discussions that are about much more than just actually throwing buildings up. And that's really, really important. That gets us to a healthy sector. We're recognising where there are gaps. I feel like we've got a team and even some of the officials at the MHCLG that understands a bit more. And Homes England, I do feel, are actually, we're seeing some progress in their thought and their ability, their willingness to look at new and innovative things. So I'm actually quite optimistic.
Yeah, just quickly. So on the LHA question, join our campaign to get it sorted out. That's absolutely now. And the team can talk to you more and more about that. I mean, it's complete madness. Talk to any politician wants to they'll tell you it's mad. Need sorting out. Get them in a room and they just suddenly disagree with you for a particular treasury room. So I think, and just finally, I think, just to be optimistic, there are loads and loads of proven solutions to prevent homelessness. Alex's improvement pathway, we know how to prevent homelessness coming out of tools. We just need to scale up across the country. Similarly for care leavers, for prison leavers, for a whole range of other populations. The strategy's got to pick up on what we already know, where the evidence base already is. And there are definitely things that can be done now to help people living in temporary accommodation now, help children now. There are plenty of solutions for other people on that. So I think we can build from what we know is right. And just keep the pressure on for much sort of bigger vision going forward.
In terms of how we achieve political will, I mean, I'm politically impartial, but politically neutral newspaper, so I'm not allowed to campaign. But what I would say is that actually we did get a housing benefit boost after, I think it was the temporary accommodation in PPG, where I talked about some of the people that were being impacted by all of this, and then DWP officials messaged me. And I know that they then spoke to the Treasury, and then we got that boost from Jeremy Hunt. And I actually do think one of the most powerful things here is talking about people. Everybody knows about, but when you start saying LHA upraising, that doesn't really cut through to my readers. But if I put a picture of a person and I represent the problem through their story, it does seem to have an impact. So that might be useful.
Yeah, just on the chain, they completely understand, and there is that growing political recognition about the cost of failure. many of them here on the panel this afternoon, and that in terms of the stability that we now have for new build, I would like to see a focus on some of the capital social care solutions and the recognition about having to really invest in recognise the need for supported housing and recognise some of the specialist housing challenges that we face. It feels like that's the next step to go from what I think is now a political consensus about new build of homes.
Thank you all so much. If you could all join me in thanking our experts.
Good.